The Varath Expanse was the kind of place that did not appear on any official map. Not because no one had charted it, but because every civilization in the Galactic Accord had quietly agreed, without ever writing it down, that it was better left alone. It was a dead stretch of space sitting at the far edge of the galactic arm, where stars were old and cold, and the dust between them had not moved in a million years. No shipping lanes passed through it, no patrol routes touched its border. It was, by every practical definition, nowhere. That was exactly why Drevik Sol had chosen to send his crew there. Drevik was the operations chief of the Corvani Salvage Consortium, a company that made its money finding things other people had lost or thrown away. Over 200 years, the consortium had built a modest fortune pulling wrecked ships out of dead orbits, stripping their cores and selling the parts to whoever would pay. It was not glamorous work, but it was profitable, and Drevik liked profit more than he liked glamour. The tip had come from a deep-range probe the consortium had launched 3 years ago into the Expanse, more out of habit than hoping. The probe had returned a mass signature before going silent, something large, something dense, something that did not match any natural formation in the database. Drevik had stared at the numbers for 2 weeks before finally authorizing a crew to go check it out. The ship he sent was called the Asterisk. Reckless ambition, crewed by 11 Corvani and 3 hired specialists, a structural analyst, a materials expert, and a historian named Reactivated, who was old and small and had the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years reading old texts in bad lighting. Reth had been brought along because the probe's data had contained faint traces of an energy signature that the consortium's algorithm flagged as culturally unclassified. Reth was the kind of person you called when something didn't fit any known box. The journey to the Expanse took 9 days. When the Asterisk Reckless Ambition dropped out of faster than light travel, and the crew got their first look at what the probe had found, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. It was a ship, that much was obvious, but it was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. Most warships in the Galactic Accord followed a certain design logic, sleek, angular, built for speed and efficiency. They were elegant in the way that tools were elegant, shaped purely by function. What floated before them now looked nothing like that. It was massive, far larger than anything a civilian salvage crew had any business approaching. Its hull was black, not painted black, but burned black, scorched by some ancient and incredible heat that had fused the outer plating into something almost glassy. Despite that, the hull was thick, absurdly thick, with layered armor that the structural analyst immediately began muttering about in disbelief. Weapon ports lined every surface, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, arranged overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible angle. The ship was not elegant, it was brutal. It looked like it had been built by someone who had sat down and asked a single question: what would it take to keep fighting even when everything else had been destroyed? It was also completely silent. No running lights, no beacon, no energy output that the reckless ambitions Asterisk sensors could detect. It was cold and dark and still, and it had been that way, judging by the micro debris patterns around its hull, for a very, very long time. Reactivated pressed himself against the observation window and stared at it with wide eyes. Give me a close pass, he said quietly. I want to see the hull markings. The pilot brought the asterisk reckless. Ambition in slow and careful, sliding. Along the flank of the massive ship like a small fish circling something it couldn't quite believe was real. The hull markings were there, faint, half-eaten by centuries of micro-impacts and radiation, but still visible in certain sections where the armor had protected them. They were not in any script that the pilot or the crew chief or the materials expert recognized, but Reth recognized them. He recognized them the way you recognize something from a dream, dimly, with a cold feeling in the stomach that came before the actual memory arrived. He pulled up his reference archive. He cross-checked twice, then he set the archive down and stood very still. Those are human markings, he said. The crew chief, a broad-shouldered Corvani named Torvin, turned to look at him. What? The script, the hull designation, it's human. Reth said the word carefully. The way you said the name of something. Dangerous, old human pre-extinction. Era. Torvin stared at him. Humans have been dead for 800 years. Yes, Reth agreed, they have. Nobody had a good response to that, so for a while they just kept staring at the ship. Eventually, Torvin made the decision that Drevik's soul was paying him to make. He ordered the crew to suit up and board. The docking procedure took 2 hours. The dead ship had no active port systems, so they had to cut through a secondary hull panel and force their way into a maintenance corridor. The corridor was dark and airless and cold enough that their breath would have frozen if they hadn't been wearing sealed suits. They moved through it in a line, their helmet lights cutting thin beams through the absolute black, and the sound of their boots on the metal floor was very loud in the silence. What they found inside was not what any of them had expected. They had expected wreckage, battles left, wreckage, broken equipment floating, debris, the marks of fire and impact, and explosive decompression. There was some of that in certain sections where old damage had clearly never been repaired. But most of the ship was intact, not just intact, preserved. The corridors were long and clean and orderly. Equipment was stored neatly and secured. Racks. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, as if the crew had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to come right back. And then they found the pods. The first corridor of them appeared, without warning, branching off from the main passage, a wide, high-ceilinged hall that stretched further than their lights could reach in both directions. Along every wall from floor to ceiling were hibernation pods, hundreds of them. Each one sealed, each one dark, each one roughly the size and shape of a person. The structural analyst ran a quick count based on the corridor dimensions and came up with a number that made him go quiet. He shared it with Torvin in a private channel. Torvin pulled up the ship's general layout on his scanner. The scanner was working mostly on passive readings since there was nothing active to ping off of, and realized that this was not the only corridor like this. There were dozens of them running through the entire midsection of the ship, thousands of pods, perhaps tens of thousands. Are they empty? One of the crew asked. Nobody wanted to walk up and check. Eventually, the materials expert did it, pressing her scanner against the nearest pod and running a passive biologic sweep. She checked the result, checked it again. No, she said, they're not empty. Torvin took that information and made a command decision. He told the historian and the specialists to keep cataloging, posted 2 crew members to watch the corridor, and led the rest of the team toward what the passive scanner suggested was the ship's command core, the brain of the vessel, located in the upper central section of the hull. Getting there took another hour of navigation through dark corridors and one manually cranked pressure door. When they finally reached the command core, it was a large circular room with a high ceiling and a central console that was still connected to the ship's emergency power cells that, impossibly, still held a residual charge. After 8 centuries, there was a screen on the console. It was on, barely just a thin glow running on whatever dregs of power the emergency cells still held. And on the screen, on a slow and patient loop, was a recording. It was short, it was in galactic standard, which surprised all of them, because it meant someone had added it after the original crew had gone into stasis, or it had been prepared for exactly this moment, for exactly the kind of outsider who might one day find the ship. The figure on the screen was a woman in a dark uniform. Her face was calm, her eyes were direct, she looked thought like someone who had thought very carefully about everything she was going to say and had chosen each word with complete precision. She said, "If you have found this vessel, you have made a terrible mistake. Leave now. Do not attempt to access any ship systems. Do not attempt to open the hibernation units. Do not remove any component from this ship. This is the only warning you will receive, whatever you came here looking for. It is not worth what will happen if you stay." Then the recording looped and started again from the beginning. Torvin watched it 3 times, then he turned to his crew. "Start pulling the reactor assembly," he said. "We'll have it out in 6 hours. Rethcavel looked at him. "You heard what it said?" "I heard a dead woman on a dead ship," Torvin said. "Whatever this thing was, it's been sitting here for 800 years without doing anything to anybody. It's not going to start now." Reth looked back at the woman on the screen. She was still talking, still calm, still patient, like someone who had all the time in the world. He had a feeling, very deep and very certain, that Torvin was wrong. But he was a historian, not a soldier. And the crew chief was already walking away, and so Reth stood there alone, the dim light of the command core, and watched the recording loop again while somewhere deep in the ship his colleagues began cutting into the reactor housing. They were 40 minutes into the extraction when the ship's lights came on. Not slowly, not flickering, all at once. Every light on every deck blazing bright and steady and immediate, as if the ship had simply been waiting for the right moment and had decided that moment was now. Torvin's radio filled with voices, his crew all talking at once, all saying variations of the same thing. Reth heard it from where he stood in the command core, and he did not say anything because the console in front of him had come fully to life, and the screen that had been showing the looped recording was now showing something else entirely. A single line of text in clean, modern, galactic standard. It said, "Dormancy broken, priority Omega sequence initiated, all SYSDEMS nominal." And then from somewhere in the walls of the ship, from everywhere and nowhere at once, came a voice. It was a woman's voice, clear and calm, and utterly without emotion, and it said, "Hello, I am Asterisk, MARA, welcome aboard the Asterisk, remembrance of Ruin asterisk, please remain where you are. The Admiral will be with you shortly. In the long corridors of hibernation, pods deep in the body of the ancient ship, something began to move, a sound, like 10,000 locks releasing at once, moved through the hull like a wave. Cold mist rolled out across the floors, as seals broke and air flooded sealed chambers for the first time in 800 years. And in the pods, after 8 centuries of silence, the dead began to wake up. The first sound Admiral Sarah Voss heard when she woke up was the hum of the ship. She knew that sound. She had spent 23 years listening to it, the low, steady vibration that ran through the asterisk remembrance of ruin. Asterisk hull when all its systems were alive and running. It was the sound of a ship that was healthy, a ship that was ready. For one brief moment in the soft confusion between sleep and awareness, she thought she was simply waking up in her bunk after a long rest. Then the cold hit her and the stiffness in every joint hit her, and she remembered. She sat up slowly in the open pod. Mist from the cryo seal was still rolling around her feet. Her lungs ached when she breathed the way they always did after a long stasis cycle. Like her body had forgotten how breathing worked and was now relearning it from scratch. Around her, in every direction, she could hear the sounds of other pods opening, the soft hiss of released seals, the low groans and coughing of people coming back to life one breath at a time. Amara, she said, her voice came out, rough and dry. Admiral Voss, the AI's voice, was exactly as she remembered it, calm, precise, present. I am glad you are awake. There are some things I need to tell you. Status of the ship first. All primary systems nominal, weapons at 89% capacity. Fabrication units have been running continuously and have addressed most of the structural damage sustained at the Battle of Callum Station. Hull integrity is at 94%. Reactors are fully online. A brief pause. I should note that the reactor restart was assisted, unintentionally, by an external party. Voss was already pulling herself out of the pod, her legs held barely. Explain. We have guests aboard. I will explain further once you are fully mobile. It took Voss 11 minutes to get to the command core, walking at less than half her normal pace, her hand on the corridor wall for support. Around her, soldiers in various states of recovery were moving through the ship, some walking steadily, some sitting against the walls, some still just standing in the corridors blinking at the lights. A few of her senior officers fell into step behind her without being asked. Nobody spoke much. There was too much to process and not enough information yet to say anything useful. When she reached the command core and saw the 11 Corvani standing in a cluster near the far wall, her expression did not change. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, steadily, without hurry. She turned to MARA's primary speaker. Note how long. 812 years, 3 months and 17 days, MAR. Said. The stasis systems performed within expected parameters. Crew survival rate is 91%. Losses occurred primarily in pods that sustained physical damage during the Battle of Callum Station before we entered the Expanse. Voss absorbed that 580 people dead in their pods, never knowing. She filed it away. There would be time to grieve properly later. Right now she needed information. She turned to the Corvani. They were small by her standards, most of the galactic species she had dealt with before the war were. They had gray-brown skin, large dark eyes, and the look of people who very badly wanted to be somewhere else. The one in front, a big one who was probably in charge, was trying to hold himself together with visible effort. "Who are you?" she asked. The big one answered. His name was Torvin. He told her they were salvagers from something called the Corvani Salvage Consortium. He said they had found the ship by accident following a probe signal. He said they had not known the pods were occupied. Voss listened without interrupting. Then she asked the question she actually needed answered. She asked what year it was. Torvin told her, and she did the math silently. She asked who was currently in political power in the central systems. Torvin described something called the Galactic Accord, a governing body of 12 major species. She did not recognize the structure, but the concept was familiar enough. She asked which species held the most power. He named two: the Vrethk Dominion and the Sarathi Consensus. She recognized those names. She recognized them very well. She asked carefully about humanity. She asked what the official record said about what had happened. What followed was the most difficult conversation Sarif Voss had ever sat through, and she had sat through court-martial, 2 peace negotiations that ended in gunfire, and the final command briefing before the last battle of a war her side had already lost. Torvin told her haltingly, with the discomfort of someone delivering news they knew was going to land badly, that humanity was considered extinct, that the extinction was described in a Fifth Accord history as a pacification event, that it was taught in schools as a necessary measure taken against a species that had been dangerously expansionist, that the anniversary of the culling was, on some Vrethkai worlds, a minor holiday. Torvin stopped talking. The command corps was very quiet. Voss's senior officers were standing behind her. She did not turn around to look at them. She did not need to. She could feel the quality of the silence they were producing, the specific, tight, controlled silence of people who were holding something very large and very hot very carefully, because they knew that if they put it down right now, something would break. She gave them 30 seconds of that silence, then she spoke. "MARA," she said, "full weapons. Diagnostic. I want a complete readiness report within the hour. Already running, Admiral. Preliminary results are very positive." "Good." She turned back to Torvin. "Crew will be treated as non-combatants. You will be housed in a secure section of the ship, and you will not be harmed. I have one more question for you." Torvin nodded, looking somewhat relieved that she was still talking instead of something else. "The Accord, do they have a communication system, a central broadcast frequency?" "Yes," Torvin said slowly. "Standard galactic relay. Every ship and station in Accord space can receive on it." "Good," Voss said. "MARA, get me access to the relay." "I already have it." "Admiral, shall I open a channel?" "Not yet." She thought for a moment. "Torvin, I am going to release one of your crew, the one you trust the most. I'm going to give them a message to carry, and I am going to let them take your ship back into Accord space. The rest of you will stay here until I know we are not about to be ambushed the moment we come out of the expanse." Torvin opened his mouth and then closed it again. He made the calculation very Quickly, one crew member free was better than no crew members free, and nodded. The message, Voss said, is this: humanity is not extinct. They should adjust their records. She turned away from him then because there was a great deal of work to do, and she had already spent more time on this than she could afford. Over the next several hours, the remembrance of ruin came fully to life around her. Soldiers moved through the ship with purpose, running checks, reporting to stations, falling back into routines that their muscles remembered, even if their minds were still catching up to where they were. The ship's fabrication units, which MARA had been running on low power for centuries, had done extraordinary work. Ammunition stocks replenished, damaged conduits replaced, worn mechanical components rebuilt from raw material the ship carried in its deep storage holds. MARA presented her readiness report. At the 1 hour mark, it was, as she had said, very positive. Voss spent another 2 hours reading everything MARA had gathered from passive observation during the long sleep: accord communications, political records, military dispositions, technical specifications of current Accord warships. The Accord had advanced in some ways. Over 8 centuries, their energy weapons were more efficient, their computing systems were faster, their medical technology was genuinely impressive, but their warship design philosophy had not changed in any fundamental way. They still built for speed and elegance. They still prioritized offense over defense at the fleet level, trusting to numbers and coordination. They still thought about war the same way they had thought about it 800 years ago, because they had not had a serious threat to adapt to. They had spent 800 years fighting smaller species with inferior weapons. They had never had to fight humans again. Voss pulled up the weapons manifest. Remembrance of ruin had been built as an arc carrier, the largest class of warship the United Human Systems had ever constructed, designed specifically to fight alone against coalition forces, to keep fighting after everything else was gone. It had been built to be the last ship standing. The designers had been, she thought with a quiet pride, very thorough. She thought about the 8 billion people who had not made it. She thought about the colony worlds, the station cities, the generation ships. She thought about the children. She thought about all of it for exactly as long as she could afford to, and then she put it somewhere deep and sealed it there for later, and stood up straight. MARA, she said, set a course for the galactic core, standard approach. Vector nothing aggressive. I want them to see us coming. Course plotted, Admiral. A brief pause. The crew, Admiral, they know where we are going. They know what we are sailing toward. Yes. Should I expect any difficulty? Voss thought about the silence her officers had kept in the command core. The controlled, careful silence of people holding something hot and large. She thought about how long they had slept and what they had woken up to and what she had asked them to do with it. No, she said, there won't be any difficulty. She was right, there was none. When the remembrance of ruin turned away from the dead dark of the Verath expanse and pointed itself toward the heart of the galaxy, every soldier aboard was already at their station. Nobody had been ordered there. They had simply gone because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else they were going to do, and they had all made their peace with that in the quiet space Between the moment they woke up and the moment they started moving, the ship accelerated slowly at first, its ancient engines building power with a deep, steady rumble that ran through the entire hull. Then faster than very fast, stars stretched into lines in the expanse, fell away behind them, and the asterisk, remembrance of ruin, moved out into a galaxy that had forgotten it existed. In a small guest cabin near the middle of the ship, Reactivated the historian sat against the wall with his knees pulled up to his chest in his archive reader in his lap, and he did not read anything because he kept thinking about the look in Admiral Voss's eyes when she had heard what the Accord called the culling. It had not been rage he had expected. Rage, what he had seen, was something quieter than rage and much more frightening. It was the look of someone who had just been handed a very clear and complete picture of a problem and was already in full calm working out what to do about it. He thought about the size of the ship around him. He thought about those weapon ports, hundreds of them. He thought about MARA saying all systems nominal in that pleasant, even voice. He held his archive reader and did not read, and the ship flew on through the dark toward the lights of civilization. The news traveled faster than the ship. That was because Torvin's released crew member, a young pilot named Ceci, chosen because she was the fastest and because Torvin trusted her completely, had burned every ounce of fuel the asterisk reckless ambition could hold. Getting back to Accord space, she had not stopped to eat or sleep properly. She had jumped in and out of faster than light travel so many times. Her navigation system had thrown 3 warnings. She had arrived at the nearest Accord communications relay station, pale, shaking, and absolutely certain that whatever was coming behind her was not going to wait long. What she uploaded to the relay was everything: her helmet camera footage from inside the ship, the audio of MARA's voice, the footage of the hibernation corridors, the footage of Admiral Voss standing in the command core and listening to Torvin describe the culling with the expression of someone making a very careful note. The relay system pushed it across all Accord space automatically because it was tagged with a dozen emergency markers that the relay's AI flagged as priority content. By the time the asterisk remembrance of ruin crossed the border of the expanse and entered monitored space, the footage had been seen by roughly 400 million people on 67 worlds. The numbers were climbing fast. Reactions were varied on many worlds. The general population watched with a mixture of confusion and nervous fascination. The images were strange. The ship was clearly very old, and the woman in the recording looked like she had been through something terrible and had come out the other side without losing a single degree of composure, which most people found either admirable or unsettling depending on their temperament. On academic networks, historians were already shouting at each other in text channels, divided between those who were treating it as a potential hoax and those who were pulling every archived record of human ship design they could find and comparing it to the whole footage. On Vrethkai Prime, the government went into emergency closed session within 40 minutes of the footage reaching their systems. They did not issue any public statement. This was noted. The Galactic Accord's High Council moved faster. A diplomatic flotilla was assembled within 18 hours, 12 vessels, mix of light cruisers and diplomatic carriers led by a senior high speaker. Named the Sevik, it was not a war fleet the council had discussed making. It won, but the Vrethkai representative had advised patience, one old ship, however large, thousands of crew members who had been asleep for 8 centuries and would be confused, physically weakened, and overwhelmed by how much had changed. It was not a military problem, the Vrethka representative had said. It was a management problem. The Sevik had agreed. He was, by all accounts, a reasonable and experienced diplomat, and he genuinely believed that the right combination of firm authority and offered comfort would resolve the situation within a week. He had handled refugee situations before. This was, he told himself, essentially the same thing, a group of displaced people who needed guidance and structure and who would respond well to being told that they were being taken care of. He had never read any serious history about what humans actually did when someone tried to take care of them without being asked. The flotilla intercepted the asterisk. Remembrance of ruin asterisk 3 days after the ship crossed into monitored space. The Sevik opened a channel immediately, broadcasting on all frequencies as a show of transparency. His image went out to the same relay network that had already carried the helmet footage. Whatever happened here, everyone was going to see it. Voss accepted the channel. She appeared on the screen in her uniform, clean and pressed, her gray hair pulled back, her posture the same as it had been in every frame of Ceci's helmet footage. Straight, easy, completely unhurried. Behind her, very slightly out of focus, 2 of her officers stood at their stations. The Sevik introduced himself. He expressed in the formal accord phrasing he had used 1,000 times his sincere understanding of how difficult the situation must be. He said the accord was prepared to offer sanctuary. He said that the crew of the asterisk, remembrance of ruin, would be treated with respect and given access to care and to grief counseling and to any cultural resources they needed to understand the present era. He said that in the interest of everyone's safety, he was requesting that the asterisk remembrance of ruin reduce speed, stand down its weapons, and accept an escort to a designated safe harbor where formal talks could begin. He delivered it well. He always delivered things well. Voss waited until he was fully finished. Then she said, without any particular heat in her voice, "You murdered 8 billion people. There is no jurisdiction here." The Sevik blinked. He had prepared for grief, for anger, for demands and accusations that he could work with. He had not prepared for that specific sentence delivered in that specific tone, the tone of someone stating a fact as clearly as possible and then waiting to see what you did with it. He began to say something about context and historical complexity. The asterisk remembrance of ruin cut the channel. On the flotilla's bridge, the Sevik turned to his military liaison. The military liaison had been sitting quietly through the whole exchange, watching the sensor readings of the human ship, and she looked considerably less comfortable than she had 2 minutes ago. She told the Sevik in a careful voice that the human ship's weapon systems had just fully activated across every port simultaneously, and that they were being painted by targeting systems that were unlike anything in the current Accord database. The Sevik ordered the flotilla to open fire What happened next lasted 4 minutes. That was all. Afterward, when analysts pulled the sensor logs and tried to reconstruct the engagement, they had trouble explaining it to people who hadn't seen it because the conventional vocabulary for ship combat didn't quite fit. The asterisk remembrance of ruin did not move defensively. It moved forward into the flotilla, which was not what anyone had expected a lone ship to do against 12. It moved through the flotillas formation the way a stone moves through water, continuing on its own path, affecting everything around it without being redirected. Its point defense grids burned incoming fire out of space before any of it reached the hull. Its own weapons, kinetic mass drivers, running in overlapping time sequences, energy lances hitting the same shield, points multiple times in fractions of a second, worked through the flotillas, ships methodically like someone completing a list. Every ship in the flotilla was disabled. None were destroyed, life support on. Every vessel remained intact. The asterisk remembrance of ruin did not fire a single shot that was not necessary, and it did not fire a single shot after necessity ended. Then it continued on its original course. Aboard the disabled diplomatic carrier, Thesevic sat in a heavily damaged command chair in a heavily damaged command room and tried to process what had just happened to 12 ships in 4 minutes and found he could not quite do it. Mara opened a channel to him from the asterisk remembrance of ruin. Asterisk. Your crews will need medical support. Mara said pleasantly, please inform the nearest Accord station that you require assistance. The asterisk remembrance of ruin will continue toward the galactic core. We recommend you do not send anything else to intercept us. That recommendation is offered in good faith. The channel closed. The relay network broadcast all of it, every second, to every world in Accord space. The effect was difficult to describe precisely. On some worlds it was something close to panic, on others, particularly the smaller and more politically quiet member species of the Accord, it was something that looked carefully privately in living rooms and quiet offices rather than in public. A great deal like relief. There were species in the Accord who had not chosen to be there, who had been absorbed over the decades through economic pressure or political maneuvering or the quiet application of enough military force to make the alternative seem very unattractive. 4. Those species watching a single ship tear through 12 Accord vessels in 4 minutes and then continue calmly on its way was not frightening. It was the first genuinely interesting thing that had happened in years. On the academic networks, the historians had stopped arguing about hopes. They were now pulling every human tactical archive they could find, and what they were finding was making the military analysts in the same channels very quiet. One analyst on a species-wide academic broadcast described it this way: human warship design at the time of the culling had been approximately 40 years ahead of any other species in the Accord. The expectation had been that this advantage would fade as it always did, that over 8 centuries the rest of the galaxy would catch up and surpass what humanity had built, and in some areas that had happened, but the asterisk remembrance of ruin was not a typical human warship. It was an arc carrier, a class that had never been fully studied because only 3 had ever been built, and all 3 had been thought destroyed in the war. And its AI had not been sitting dormant. It had been running, thinking, improving, running simulations for 800 years with unlimited access to the ship's fabrication systems. What came out of the expanse was not a museum piece, it was something that had spent 8 centuries doing nothing but getting better. On Vrethkai Prime, the government's emergency session extended into its 3rd day. The Vrethkai Defense Coordination Bureau issued internal mobilization orders. Quiet ones not publicly broadcast. They began moving a very large number of ships. They were not being quiet because they were afraid. They were being quiet because they did not want anyone else in the Accord to see them being afraid. Meanwhile, on 3 fringe colony worlds, small resource-poor planets on the outer rim of Accord space, home to species that had been Accord members for a long time and had found the experience consistently disappointing, people gathered in large numbers in public spaces and watched the relay broadcast on shared screens. They watched the 4-minute engagement again and again. They watched Voss say, "You murdered 8 billion people," with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided what is going to happen next. They watched the asterisk remembrance of ruin moving through Accord space uncontested, alone, not stopping. They did not cheer loudly. They were careful people who had learned to be careful. And GT snorts. And GT, but the conversations that happened in those public spaces that night and the nights after were not the kind of conversations that careful, quiet, discouraged people usually had. They were the kind of conversations you had when something you had stopped believing in had, without warning, turned out to be real. Hope was not a simple thing. It could not be aimed or controlled. It moved through populations the way a strong wind moved through a field, pressing everywhere at once, bending things, changing the shape of what was standing on the asterisk remembrance of ruin. Asterisk Admiral Voss sat in the command chair and listened to MARA's continuous stream of sensor data and intercepted Accord communications. She read the military mobilization reports from Vrethkai space. She read the fringe colony broadcasts. She read the academic analyses. She read the High Council's private emergency communications, which MARA was decrypting in real time using cryptography protocols that were 800 years old and that the Accord had never bothered to update their defenses against because they had never expected to need to. She read all of it and she thought about it, and then she pulled up MARA's navigation database and looked at a set of coordinates that only she and MARA knew existed. She had a destination in mind, not the galactic core that had been a direction of travel, not a true target. The true destination was a barren moon that the navigation database listed under a name that would mean nothing to anyone in the Accord, but which meant a great deal to her. Anchor Point 7. MARA, she said, adjust our heading. Quietly. Already done, MARA said. At current speed, we will arrive in 8 days. Voss nodded. 8 days, a lot could happen in 8 days. The Vrethkai were already moving. They would not make the mistake she suspected of sending another diplomatic mission. They were more practical than that. They would send a war fleet next because that was what they did when a management problem turned out to be something else. She was counting on it. The moon had no name on any Accord chart. It appeared in a handful of astronomical surveys as a small rocky body orbiting a dim and unimportant gas giant at the outer edge of a system that nobody had any reason to visit. Its surface was brown and gray and cracked, the kind of landscape that looked the same from every angle, dead stone and frozen dust, and in the thin atmosphere slow-moving clouds of fine grit that abraded sensor equipment and made long-range scanning difficult. It had been chosen for exactly those reasons. The asterisk remembrance of ruin entered the system quietly, running on minimum emissions, and MARA guided the ship into a low orbit over the moon's north hemisphere before dropping a single probe to the surface. The probe hit a specific point on what appeared to be a flat plane of bare rock, a point that MARA had held in her memory for 8 centuries, and transmitted a narrow beam signal downward into the rock itself, into what was below the rock. The response came back in 11 seconds. Handshake signal, old and patient, running on a power source that had been built to outlast anything that might happen above it. It is here, MARA said. There was something in her voice that Voss had heard very rarely, a slight change in cadence, something that was not quite a motion but was in the neighborhood of it. All systems intact, the facility held. Voss released a breath she had been holding for 8 days. Getting into the facility required landing a small team on the surface and operating a manual access sequence at a buried entrance point, a sequence that existed in no database except MARA's and Voss's own memory. They had put the access code there on purpose, just the two of them, 8 years before the culling, because the people who had built Anchor Point 7 had understood that digital security, no matter how good, could be broken by someone with enough time and motivation. Physical security, the kind that lived only in a person's memory, was harder. The entrance was 3 m below the surface, accessible through what looked like a naturally occurring crack in the rock. 2 of Voss's soldiers widened it with cutting tools, and then a small team followed her down into the dark, into a shaft that went straight down for 40 m before opening into something else entirely. The facility was enormous. That was the first thing that hit you, the sheer size of it, the way it opened up from the narrow shaft into a space that had no business existing under this much rock. The ceiling was 15 m up, the floor stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction. Fabrication units, storage racks, power systems, medical equipment, all of it. Precise and organized, all of it. Maintained by automated systems that had been running quietly in the dark for 8 centuries, performing the same maintenance cycles over and over without deviation or complaint. And along the walls in the same familiar configuration she had seen on that asterisk remembrance of ruin, but spread here across an even larger space, were the pods, row after row after row of them, each one sealed, each one holding its occupant in the same cold, suspended state that had held her own crew for 800 years. How many? Voss asked. 41,214. MARA said through the facility's internal speakers, which she had already interfaced with. Survival rate will not be known until wake protocols complete, but power logs show no significant anomalies over the storage period. I estimate we will lose Fewer than 1%. 40,000 people sleeping under a forgotten moon, waiting for the right code, the right signal, the right moment. Voss walked slowly along one of the pod corridors. She looked at the faces. Behind the seals, men and women, and some who were very young, their expressions completely still in the cold, each of them locked in a moment that was 800 years old. She recognized some of the project markers on the pods, civilian designations, not military, scientists, engineers, doctors, teachers, farmers. The people who had been chosen not because they could fight, but because they could build. Because the people who planned Anchor Point 7 had understood that winning was only the beginning of what came after winning, and what came after winning required a different set of skills. Begin wake protocols, she said. Gradual sequence. I don't want anyone going into shock from too fast revival. Already begun, MARA said. Estimated time to full wakefulness. Across the facility, 14 hours. Voss turned to her officers. Set up medical stations, pull everything from the ship stores that we might need, and get me a communications channel too. MARA's data bank. I want to review the archive. The archive was the other reason Anchor Point 7 mattered. Buried in the facility's data core was a record, complete, sourced, detailed of everything that had led to the culling. Human intelligence services had known it was coming. They had spent 8 years documenting it as they prepared the anchor points, because they had understood that the truth properly preserved could eventually be a more powerful weapon than any warship. Every communication between the Vreth Dominion and the Sorathi Consensus, and the 4 other species that had joined the coalition, every meeting transcript, every vote on every council, every order issued and every order carried out, the full picture of what had been decided, and by whom and why, in their own words, in their own records, captured by human intelligence networks that had been embedded in every major galactic government for 40 years before the culling began. Voss spent 6 hours reading it. Some of it she already knew from the war, the broad shape of it, the alliances and the betrayals and the public justifications. What the archive added was the private conversation underneath all of that, the real reasons. Humanity had been growing too fast, not aggressively, not violently, but growing, spreading, building, making connections with minor species that the major powers considered their economic territory. Humans had been inconvenient. They had been in the way. The language in the private communications was polite and administrative. The meaning of it was not. She flagged the archive for full broadcast, all of it, every document, every communication, every vote. MARA could push it to every relay in accord space simultaneously. But not yet. Timing mattered. What happened next was that MARA began intercepting accord communications at a rate that made it clear something had changed in the last few hours. Vrethkai military channels were suddenly very busy. They were not broadcasting on open frequencies. They were using tight beam military encryption, but MARA broke the encryption in 4 hours, using mathematical approaches that the Vrethkai had never thought to defend against, because the species that had invented them was supposed to be dead. The message in those communications was simple. A Vrethkai war fleet was assembling, not a diplomatic flotilla, not a patrol force, a war fleet over 4,000 ships drawn from active service, and reserve stations across 3 sectors. They had us heading the Anchor Point 7 system, which they had identified through a combination of the asterisk remembrance of ruins, asterisk trajectory, and some very good astrophysical analysis of what kind of location a human ghost ship would be. Trying to reach 4,000 ships, it was not a subtle number. It was a number that said, this time we will make absolutely certain. Voss read the fleet composition report. She read it twice. She sat it down on the console and sat quietly for about 30 seconds, which was the longest she had allowed herself to sit still and think since waking up. Then she pulled up the ship's weapons manifest and went to the section at the very bottom, the section that had its own separate lock, its own separate access protocol, its own warning label in 6 languages. The section marked last resort in large letters placed there by the engineers who had built the ship, who had hoped with great sincerity that this section would never need to be opened. She opened it. Mara processed what she was seeing. For a moment, Admiral, she said, carefully, are we? Read the fleet size back to me. Voss said, 4,312. Vessels, Mara said, estimated. Arrival 6 days. Are the Anchor Point people awake yet? Approximately 60% are mobile, medical. Teams are working through the rest. Good, Voss thought for another moment. Then she turned to Mara's primary speaker, broadcast on every relay. Frequency, every channel. I wanted to reach every inhabited system in accord. Space. What would you like to say? The same thing I told the flotilla, but simpler. She thought about it. Say this. We did not come back for revenge, but you are making that very difficult. Understood, Mara said, broadcasting. Now, the message went out across the relay network, and the galaxy received it the way it had received everything else. Coming from this ship, with a mixture of fear and fascination, and in certain quiet corners, a complicated gratitude that nobody was quite brave enough to express out loud in public yet. Meanwhile, something else was happening that the High Council had not anticipated, and the 3 of the smaller Accord member species, the Valesi, the Graven Collective, and an unaligned fringe species called the Uvith, had independently made contact with the asterisk remembrance of ruin through private encrypted channels, not to threaten, not to demand, to offer intelligence on Vrethkai fleet movements, supply route information, political cover in the form of public statements that would make it harder for the High Council to declare the asterisk remembrance of ruin an active enemy without fracturing its own membership. Voss accepted all of it. She was not naive about why it was being offered. These were species making a bet, hedging against a future they could now imagine, looking different than they had planned, for protecting their own interests, under the cover of something that looked like friendship. She was fine with that. She had never required people to have pure motives. She required them to have useful ones. On the relay network, the archive broadcast began 3 days later. Document by document, systematically, with MARA, providing clear and simple translations into every major Accord language, the private communications, the voting records, the orders. The effect was not instant. It never was, but in the Accord's council chambers and news networks and academic institutions, the ground shifted. Historians who had spent their careers working from the official record suddenly had a very different set of primary sources. Some of them responded with denial. Many of them went very quiet. A few of them began writing quickly and with great urgency, because what was in those documents was the kind of material that changed not just one historical conclusion but the entire structure of trust on which a government's legitimacy rested. To accord member species formally requested an emergency council review of the culling's official classification. The council denied it. The two species formally withdrew from the accord and issued a joint statement. The statement was 4 sentences long. The last sentence said that they would not fight alongside a body that had helped plan and then concealed the systematic extermination of an entire civilization and would now apparently prefer to do it again rather than answer questions about it. In the facility beneath the moon's surface, 40,000 people were waking up into a world that had moved on without them and a future that had not yet been decided. Voss walked among them, answering questions, letting the doctors and counselors do most of the immediate work, watching the faces of people as they processed what they had missed and what they were waking up to. She expected despair. She found some of that. She also found something she recognized from her own crew, a specific practical quality to the way humans sorted through disaster, a tendency almost universal to move from grief to question to plan in less time than most species thought was decent. People were already asking about the fabrication units, already asking about the power systems, already asking what they needed to build and what they needed to do and where they needed to go. She let them ask. She answered what she could, and she told them that they had about 5 days before 4,000 ships arrived. The doctors asked if she could give them more time. The engineer said 5 days was enough if they got started now. The soldiers said they had been sleeping for 800 years and were ready whenever she needed them. She went back to the asterisk, remembrance of ruin, and opened the last resort section of the manifest and got to work. The Vrethkai war fleet arrived on the 5th day, 1 day earlier than expected, because Vrethkai fleet commanders believed in the tactical value of arriving before your opponent was ready. They dropped out of faster than light travel in a wide formation designed to encircle the entire moon system. 4,312 ships arranged in a pattern that had been developed over centuries, specifically to eliminate the possibility of a surrounded target finding any angle of escape. What they found in the system was not what they had planned for. The asterisk remembrance of ruin was positioned in a high orbit above the moon, exactly as their intelligence had suggested it would be. That part was expected. What was not expected was what surrounded it, a loose formation of approximately 200 smaller human ships freshly assembled from the fabrication units inside the Anchor Point 7 facility. They were not impressive individually. They were fast-built and relatively light, and any fleet commander looking at them on a sensor display could reasonably conclude that they were not a serious military threat. The fleet's supreme commander, High Admiral Dreneth, looked at the display for about 20 seconds before deciding that the smaller ships were a distraction and that the real threat was the arc carrier at the center. He issued a formation order: compress. The encirclement, focus fire on the asterisk remembrance of ruin asterisk. Maintain spacing to minimize the effect of whatever the human ship was doing. With those deep system power signatures that his analysts had been flagging for 2 hours without being able to explain. The battle that followed lasted 12 hours. That number is important because most battles of comparable force disparity, 4,000 ships against one, even against one with support, lasted either much less time or much more. They lasted less time when the smaller force was simply overwhelmed. They lasted much more time when neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The battle at Anchor Point 7 lasted exactly 12 hours because that was how long it took for the asterisk remembrance of ruin and its assembled forces to dismantle the Vrethkai fleet systematically without destroying any of it. In 12 hours was how long that specific operation took when run at the pace Voss had chosen, not the fastest pace possible but the most methodical one. The last resort systems, which MARA had spent the last 4 days bringing to full readiness, were the reason the math worked out the way it did. They were not weapons in the conventional sense. They did not fire projectiles or beams. They were electromagnetic in nature, operating a frequency range that no current accord ship was shielded against because shielding against them required knowing they existed. What they did when activated across wide area was interfere selectively and precisely with specific drive and weapon systems while leaving life support and communications entirely intact. The effect looked from outside like the targeted ships were simply and inexplicably shutting themselves down. Dranath watched a third of his fleet go dark in the first 2 hours and initially believed it was a systems failure spreading through a shared software vulnerability. He sent diagnostic orders. The diagnostic teams reported no software failure. They reported that their equipment simply was not working in ways that their equipment was not supposed to be able to stop working. He sent a second wave of ships forward. They also went dark. He began issuing retreat orders to the sections of the fleet that still had full operational capability, which by the 4th hour was roughly half his force. The retreat did not go cleanly. The 200 smaller human ships which had not, as it turned out, been a distraction were positioned specifically to complicate any large-scale retreat, using speed and harassment fire to break up fleet formations and force individual commanders to make individual decisions rather than operating as a coordinated whole. Dranath watched his fleet fragmented exactly the way he had been trained never to allow a fleet to fragment. The asterisk remembrance of ruin moved through the engagement with the same quality of motion that Thesavic's flotilla had experienced, forward, calm, purposeful, like a body of water finding its own level. MARA managed the ship systems with the precision of 800 years of simulation, anticipating fleet movements before they fully formed, responding to threats in the time it took a Vrethka tactical officer to identify them. Voss sat in the command chair and watched and gave orders when they were needed and mostly let MARA work. Because there were some things that an 800-year-old AI running on an unbroken chain of strategic simulations simply did better than any human. At the 6-hour mark, Dranath attempted to contact the asterisk remembrance of ruin directly. He was not attempting to negotiate. He wanted to know what was being done to his ships. He had never, in 40 years of military service, encountered a weapon he could not identify or explain, and the inability to explain it was affecting his commander's morale more than the losses were. Mara accepted the channel. Voss appeared on his screen. "What are you doing to my ships?" Dreeneth asked. He was a large, gray-scaled Vrethkai with a commander's bearing, and at this moment the look of a person who was holding a great deal of composure together through sheer force of habit. "Disabling them," Voss said, "not destroying them. Your crews will be fine. That is not a weapon in any database." "No," she agreed, "it wouldn't be." There was a pause. Dreeneth's eyes moved to something off-screen, a sensor reading probably, and then came back to her. "You could have destroyed us." "Yes. Why didn't you?" Voss looked at him steadily. "Because I need you to go home and tell your government what happened here. A dead fleet tells no one anything. A fleet full of living commanders who experience this personally is a much better message." Dreeneth stared at her for a long moment. She could see him processing that. A military commander, running the logic of what she had said and finding, probably to his discomfort, that it was completely correct. "What do you want?" he asked. "That's not a conversation we're having today," she said. "Today we're finishing this. You can reach your High Council when you get home." She closed the channel. By hour 12, the engagement was over. Most of the Vrethkai fleet was dark and drifting, not destroyed, not damaged in any way that would endanger the crews, but completely inoperable. Approximately 400 ships that had successfully retreated in the early stages of the battle were moving away from the system at full speed. Voss let them go. They were the ones who would reach the High Council first, which served her purposes exactly. Her own forces had taken damage. The 200 smaller ships had been built fast and light, and some of them had not survived. She had lost people, not many, by the standards of the engagement, but not zero. She sat with that, as she always did, without letting it become something she could not carry. The relay network had been broadcasting the entire engagement, every second of it, live across every inhabited system in Accord space. In the aftermath, the galactic political situation moved faster than it had ever moved in the memory of any living political analyst. 2 more Accord member species formally withdrew. 1 issued a statement expressing complete neutrality and immediately began diplomatic contact with the new human forces, which everyone understood meant something closer to alignment than it did to neutrality. The Sarathi consensus, which had been the second largest participant in the original culling coalition after the Vrethka, went completely silent on all public channels for 36 hours, which was unprecedented in their history of very vocal political engagement. 3 days after the battle, the Galactic Accord's High Council requested formal communications with Admiral Voss. She accepted. The Council expected demands. They had spent 3 days preparing for demands: territorial, political, economic, military. They had war game simulations on what humanity would likely ask for and what the Accord could afford to give. They had advisors who had studied every human historical record they could access, looking for patterns in how Humans negotiated after military victories. None of their preparations were useful. Because Voss did not negotiate, she presented 3 terms and said, without hostility or aggression, that they were not a starting point for discussion. They were the terms. The council could accept them or it could refuse them, and if it refused them, she would continue. And the council could consider what the last 9 days had demonstrated about what that meant. The 3 terms were read into the official record in 12 languages simultaneously. The first was full galactic acknowledgement of the culling as a crime against sapient life, not as a political event, not as a historical complexity, but as a crime defined specifically and clearly and permanently, enshrined in a court law and in the official historical record of every member species. The second was the cession of 3 uninhabited but resource-rich star systems, ones that MARA's 8 centuries of passive observation had identified as having everything needed for a civilization to build itself from scratch as the sovereign territory of a new human republic with all the political standing and protections that implied. The third was the dissolution of the Vrethkai and Sarathi permanent seats on the High Council, replaced by a rotating system in which every member species held equal standing with seats assigned by population and elected by the member worlds rather than held by the largest military powers. The council chamber was very quiet for a long time after the terms were read. The Vrethkai representative began to speak. He spoke for about 30 seconds before the representatives of 4 smaller species all began speaking at the same time loudly, having clearly decided that this was the moment they had been waiting for, and the Vrethkai representative stopped speaking because there was no point in continuing. The vote took 6 hours. The terms were accepted. There was no celebration on the asterisk. Remembrance of ruin asterisk, not immediately. There was a kind of silence that settled over the ship, the specific silence of people who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it down and were standing still in the aftermath of that, feeling the strange new lightness of it and not quite sure what to do with their hands. Voss went to the observation deck. It was a long room on the upper hull with a wide viewport that ran the full length of the space, and from it you could see stars in every direction. She stood there alone for a while looking out. Mara spoke through the room speakers. Quietly, the colony transports from Anchor Point 7 are ready to begin loading. Admiral, the first wave is prepared to move to the new systems whenever you give the order. Below the ship she could see them. Transports that had been assembled in the facility over the last few days. Blocky and practical, not elegant in any way. Full of people. Full of engineers and doctors and farmers and teachers and all the ordinary necessary things that were the actual substance of a civilization. The parts that didn't get talked about in historical records, but that determined whether the historical records ever got written at all. Give the order, she said. Done, Mara said. Navigation confirms the heading, the first colony. Transports are moving. Voss watched them go. They moved slowly. At first heavy with their cargo and then faster, pulling away from the moon. And from the asterisk remembrance of ruin asterisk pointing themselves toward a set of coordinates that had been locked in MARA's navigation system since before the culling. 3 star systems, empty, waiting full of everything needed. She thought about what came next, the political work, and there was an enormous amount of it. The building, and there was more of that than anyone lifetime could fully account for. The process of becoming a civilization, again, which was slow and complicated, and unglamorous and absolutely necessary. She thought about the 11 other anchor points still in MARA's database, each one holding its own cargo of sleeping survivors waiting for the right signal. She thought about the Vrethkai representatives' face when the terms were read, and the faces of the smaller species representatives when the vote went through, and the broadcast she had seen from the fringe colony worlds, the people standing in public squares, watching the relay screens, talking to each other in the way people talked when something had changed and they were trying to figure out what it meant for them. There was a great deal of work ahead. That was fine. Humans had always been good at work. She allowed herself one small, tired smile, not triumphant, just real, the smile of someone who had done what needed to be done and was now thinking about what needed to be done next. MARA, she said, the other anchor points, how long to reach the closest? 1. At standard speed, 11 days. Good, Vass said, set course. Plotting now, Admiral. She stayed at the observation window. Moment longer, watching the colony transport shrink to bright points among the stars. Around them the galaxy went on, vast and complicated and full of species that were right now in the middle of changing their understanding of what kind of universe they lived in. That process would take time. It would be uneven and difficult, and some of it would go wrong before it went right. That was how things always went. But in classrooms on 100 worlds, teachers were already pulling up new materials. In government offices, officials were reviewing documents they had been certain they would never need to review. In quiet homes on fringe worlds, people were having conversations with their children about a species that the history books had called extinct. They were correcting the history books. Now that was something. Humanity had not come back as a ghost. It had not come back as a ruin or a remnant or a memory. It had come back the way it had always done everything. Forward, practical, and with considerably more prepared than anyone had expected. The galaxy had made a mistake 800 years ago when it decided that the story was over. It turned out it had been chapter 1 all along, and the rest of the book was only just beginning.